We had a reading from 1 Peter, but can I ask you to flick back in your Bibles to Daniel 6, page 891, that is, and the turquoise-coloured Bibles or whatever, and the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel chapter 6. Now, I deliberately didn't ask Jenny to read all the way through Daniel 6, because I'm assuming, one can't always make these assumptions, that you're fairly familiar with the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And on the face of this could be one of the shortest sermons in history, because it could be the king asked everybody to bow down, Daniel didn't, and therefore Daniel was arrested, thrown in the lion's den, and God saved him. Exit? Yeah? Will that do? I think there might be rather more that we can take from the story. Or not, depending on how much you want to listen this morning. If you want to just read through the story, then feel free. But I think there's more that we can take from it if we're really open-minded. And these are the sort of headings that I want for you to tuck in the back of your mind as we're exploring the story together. So, belief in God costs something. It actually doesn't cost us a lot. Really, at this moment in time. We're not going to be arrested as we walk out of church this morning. At least, I presume we're not going to be. And certainly we're not going to be thrown into a lion's den. But maybe, as time goes on, who knows what our belief in God may cost us. And we need to be prepared for that. God will never leave or forsake us. That's absolutely true. There's some great words at the end of Romans chapter 8 where it says, can death separate us from God? Can life separate us from God? Can the powers of evil? Can angels or demons? Nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. And they are fantastic words, aren't they? Absolutely brilliant. How true. God will be vindicated. God will come out on top no matter what. Even though when we look at our tellies and when we open our newspapers and we see some of the desperate situations there are around the world today, it may seem as if those powers are more dominant than God. But ultimately, he will always come out on top. And God will rescue. The whole Bible, from start to finish, is the story of God rescuing mankind. It's his story doing that. It's the story of his rescue mission for us. Other thoughts may come into your mind besides those four as we explore the chapter together, but those are the main four I want you to try and keep there as we go forward. If you haven't been around for this story of Daniel, as we've unpacked it over these last few weeks, here's a very quick reminder of the context. It takes place around about 500 years before Jesus was born, okay? The Jewish nation had been defeated by a king called Nebuchadnezzar, and they'd been hauled into Babylon. Jerusalem and the city and the temple had been razed to the ground. So they're in exile. Daniel and three of his friends had been spotted as particular talent to train up in the king's service. And they've been selected, trained, and have risen to positions of authority in the Babylonian Empire. They've shown themselves to be loyal in that service, despite being in a foreign land. And more importantly, they've shown themselves to be obedient to God, no matter what comes their way. And along the way, there are all sorts of miracles about fiery furnaces and all sorts of stuff like that. Last Sunday evening, those of you who are here, Chris has been preaching through, and Greg before that, through the Sermon on the Mount. And Chris preached on that passage about treasures in heaven and whether it's possible to be wealthy in this world and actually still be faithful to God. Well, I can imagine that Daniel and his friends gained status, they gained power, they probably became quite wealthy as well during this period. But at their core, like a stick of rock right way through their center, if you broke them open, was their faithfulness to God. Just before we look at chapter 6, Can I just share with you something that worried me in recent weeks as part of the general election? You recognise this fellow, Tim Farron? These are some quotes from him recently. I'll need to stand back and read them. I haven't got them in front of me. From the first day of my leadership, I've faced questions about my Christian faith. Tim Farron's a committed Christian, evangelical Christian. I've tried to answer with grace and patience. Sometimes my answer could have been wiser. Consequences of the focus of on my faith is that I've found myself torn between living as a faithful Christian and serving as a political leader. To be a political leader, especially of a progressive Liberal Party in 2017, and to live as a committed Christian, to hold faithfully to the Bible's teaching, has felt impossible for me. And he's resigned as the head of the Liberal Party, Liberal Democrats. That really worries me. You talk about compromising. I don't know. I've never spoken to Tim Farron, but those of you who followed the general election know that he was particularly picked on in terms of his views about abortion and gay marriage. And I don't know if he was forced into a compromise in terms of his political view against his Christian view. But things became very difficult, and in the end, he's resigned. It's a really difficult position that he was placed in. Anyway, by the time we come to Daniel 6, open your Bibles, as I say, look at Daniel 6. We've got this fellow called Darius the Mede, who's taken over the Babylonian kingdom. He's believed to be the same person as Cyrus the Great of Persia. That's why you have the Medes and the Persians mentioned at various times as being the same sort of thing as you go through this chapter. And Darius has started to allow the Jewish people to go back to Jerusalem. It's referred to in another book of the Bible called Ezra. They've gone back and they started to build the temple. And in chapter 2 of Ezra, there's a list of hundreds of thousands of the Jewish people that have gone back to start rebuilding Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple, most important of all. But Daniel hasn't gone back. He's still in Babylon. I don't know if he's too valuable to Darius to let him go, or if he chooses to remain because God has actually put it on his heart to stay there. I've no idea. He's getting on a bit. Some commentators say he's into his 80s by now. So he came out into Babylon as an exile as a teenager, and he's now into his 80s. I think this is a little bit of a side message to those of us whose beards are going a bit grey nowadays, that we can still be useful in service to God, most definitely. So he's been in Babylon a very, very long time. And at the start of the chapter, Darius establishes a leadership structure. If you look down at the first few verses, we've got these satraps, sort of government ministers, and then we've got three most senior ministers over them. And Daniel is one of those. Daniel's one of the three most important people in this leadership structure that Darius sets up. Darius knew Daniel's pedigree. He will have heard about him, and that he'd served previous kings faithfully. And maybe Darius had been told about the remarkable gifts of Daniel in terms of interpreting dreams, in case he had a disturbing dream one night. Anyway, as time went on, Darius decided to promote Daniel even further. So you've got the satraps, you've got the three senior ministers, and actually Darius says, I want to make Daniel above all of them. He earned his promotion, no question. If you look at verse 3, now Daniel so distinguished himself among the chief priests and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Wow. But it had unintended consequences, that promotion, as we will see. In verses 4 and 5, the other ministers try to discredit Daniel desperately. The chief ministers and the satraps tried to find grounds and charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him He was trustworthy and neither corrupt or negligent. Bit maybe like they were, I don't know. But anyway, it was interesting that they tried to look for something in Daniel's character and they could find nothing at all. You know, the higher your profile as a professing Christian, the more likely you are to be subject to that kind of scrutiny. A bit like Tim Farron. But all of us, maybe. The higher profile our Christian witness, the more likely people are to take notice of it. Our friends, our neighbours, our families, our work colleagues. He says he's a Christian, but she goes to church on a Sunday, but have you seen? If those around us don't notice our Christian faith, maybe we need to ask ourselves why that is. Back to Daniel 6, verse 6. So these chief ministers and satraps went as a group to the king. Actually, it's a bit understated in this version of the Bible. They ganged together and they thronged into the king's chamber and almost pinned him to the wall. That's actually the kind of language that's here in the original. They didn't just petition him calmly, and they lied. Notice, they say, the royal ministers, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue this edict. All agreed? Well, actually, they didn't all agree. I don't think Daniel agreed with this at all, and he was one of the most senior people. Anyway, they lied to the king. They played to his vanity and pride by proposing that everyone should bow down to him. So a bit reminiscent of Nebuchadnezzar earlier on in Daniel, isn't it, in terms of this bit? Maybe there was a suggestion made that in this way he would cement his authority over this rather ramshackle crowd of people in Babylon that he'd conquered by having everyone bow down to him. The final snap of their trap is in verse 8. Your Majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. There's a special law, special rules around this lawmaking that was established at this time. Once a law was passed according to the Medes and the Persians, no one could undo it. So make sure before you pass this law. Anyway, because they lied to him, because he was surrounded by all of them, because he thought everybody had agreed to this, he signed on the dotted line. You should have known, shouldn't he? And we would do well to recognise in our fast-changing, politically correct world that this law could not be undone. There is only one law that cannot be undone, as we've been reminded of by Kevin already this morning, and that's this law. In Isaiah we read, "So shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth, it shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please, and it shall prosper in the thing which I sent it." Human law passes away, God's law is forever. So, Daniel, aware of the consequences, what does he do? He goes to his room, he opens the window, because that's his custom anyway, but so he's not hiding anything. And what does he do? He turns to Jerusalem and prays. I wonder if we would pray in these circumstances, knowing what would happen as a result. As he prayed, Daniel knew that everything around him in Babylon would eventually be brought to ruin. Isaiah and Jeremiah had already prophesied that, and he knew that there would be a new Jerusalem built, not just a human Jerusalem, but one beyond that as well that we read about in Revelation, and maybe we'll have the chance to meet Daniel there one day. Anyway, the leaders spied on Daniel, then they went to the king behind his back. Verse 13 is interesting. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, notice, he's a foreigner, remember? So they show rather their prejudice towards him, maybe their racial prejudice towards him. Yes, he pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. So this king who was flattered into being treated as a god knows that he is trapped. The king tries in vain to find a way out, but eventually he has to sentence Daniel to death. And as Daniel's thrown into the lion's den in verse 16, there's an irony in the king's words. So the king gave the order, they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, notice, may your God whom you serve continually rescue you. The king who was being treated as a god entrusts Daniel to the one and true God. And I don't suppose for a minute that the king expected Daniel to survive or God to rescue him. You know, when you look in children's Bibles, and maybe when you've had this taught to you in Sunday school, it's rather dumbed down, isn't it, in terms of the lion's den? These lions were deliberately starved and goaded so they would tear people limb from limb as they were thrown into the lion's den. That's what was facing Daniel. And I wonder what was in his mind, Daniel's mind, as he was thrown into the lion's den. Maybe it was those words of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego back in chapter 3, when they said, if we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So God can rescue, but God might choose not to. But even so, I'm not going to compromise. I wonder if that's in Daniel's mind. Anyway, pretend for a moment, just pretend that you don't know what happens next, okay? So Darius has a terrible night. He can't sleep for worrying. He comes down after this terrible night's sleep, rushes to the lion's den and says, verse 20, when he came near the den, he called out to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Do you think he was expecting a voice from inside, or the snoring noise of the lions having had a good feast? I wonder. Those words in verse 20 almost sound as if it's God that's been tested, rather than just Daniel. Has your God been able to rescue you from the lions? Is your God powerful enough? Now look at Daniel's reply in verse 21. This is great too. May the king live forever. He starts with respect for the king, even though this king has thrown him into a lion's den. May the king live forever. My God sent his angels. He shut the mouths of the lions. They've not heard me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I, notice, done any wrong before you, your majesty. I'm innocent. This proves it. But I still respect you, king. The devious leaders who attempted to have Daniel killed are themselves executed, thrown into the lion's den. And there's an amazing change in Darius as a result of this. If you look at verses 26 and 27, these are great. He says, I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. You know, if Daniel's kept by God in Babylon for a purpose, surely this is that purpose fulfilled. For he is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the powers of the lions. Fantastic. What a great historical story this is. What an adventure to teach in our Sunday schools. Or actually, is it a bit more than that? The story of Daniel reminds us of another story, the story of Jesus. In fact, the more you look at the story of Daniel, the more amazing the parables become. How can it be that someone who lived 500 years before Jesus was even born, the story is similar to the story of Jesus? Let's take a look at some of the similarities between the stories and then consider one difference. Now, that's very small, so let me just read those through. Here's Daniel on the left-hand side. The satraps, the political leaders, conspired against Daniel. The Jewish leaders conspired against Jesus. All through his life, they tried to catch him out. Woman caught in adultery, the coin, all sorts of things like that. Daniel's found blameless. When Jesus is put on trial, he's found blameless. Daniel's enemies come up with a plan to arrest him. Jesus' enemies bribe Judas to betray him so he could be arrested. Daniel goes into a time of prayer. Interestingly, how many times does he pray towards Jerusalem? 3 times. How many times does Jesus pray in the Garden of Gethsemane? 3 times. Daniel's accused of transgressing the law of the Medes and the Persians. Jesus is accused of breaking the law of the Jews when he's pulled up before the high priest. Daniel is subject to the ruling of authority, the authority of the land. That was Darius. Jesus is subject to Pilate as the ruling person in authority there. Darius can't sleep. Pilate's wife can't sleep. Maybe pushing it a bit too far. Darius tries to find some way to save Daniel, but eventually he sentences Darius to death. Pilate tries to find some way to save Jesus desperately, but eventually he sentences him to death. Daniel is put in the lion's den to be killed. Jesus is nailed to a cross. A giant rock is placed in front of the den and is sealed with Darius' seal. A rock is placed over the entrance of the tomb and is sealed, it says, with a Roman seal. So he's shut in there forever. At first light, Darius rushes to the lion's den. He discovers Daniel is alive. And at first light, the women go to the tomb and they discover Jesus is alive. Coincidence? Accident? Am I reading too much into the 2 stories? Don't think so. Bible is amazing. It's almost as if there's a plan for what's written in the Bible all the way through, isn't it? But there's one difference between the 2 stories. Daniel is saved. Jesus dies. Almost everything else between these 2 stories matches, but Jesus dies. Jesus dies on the cross. Daniel is saved from the lion's den. Daniel will always be known as a hero of the Bible, surviving the lion's den, a man of great, unwavering faith. But the death that Jesus died on the cross will echo through eternity. He will always be known for it. It's the fulfillment of God's plan for humanity. It's our gateway into heaven. So if we go right back to where we started, belief in God costs something. When Daniel went up to his room to pray, he knew that there would be a consequence. Maybe you're having a hard time for your faith right now, within your family or at work. If you're not, be thankful, but be ready. It's a fast-changing world out there. God will never leave us or forsake us. God was with Daniel in the presence of an angel in the lion's den. He was with Daniel and his friends through that whole period of exile in Babylon. No matter what we may face, God will always be there, right beside us. God will be vindicated. When Daniel was thrown to the lions, when Jesus was nailed to the cross, God was in charge. Even though it seems as though the powers of evil had won, the victory was God's. Satan is the one who's defeated, and one day every knee will bow at the name of Jesus. And God will rescue. When we face the greatest trials of our lives, whatever they may be, we may not be rescued in the same way as Daniel, but we will be rescued. Some Christians today are persecuted, tortured, even killed just for holding onto their faith, just for owning one of these. It's not because they have less faith than Daniel. Far from it. Who can question their faith and perseverance? And I can only pray that I'd have the strength and the courage to stand up under the same kind of pressures. They stand up for what they believe because they believe that God will finally rescue them. They believe that Jesus' tomb is not a place of defeat. It's empty. It's a place of victory, as it will be for us. Jenny read those words to us from 1 Peter. You might have wondered why we read that rather than Daniel. Well, in verses 6 to 9, you have these words, in all this, because they were enduring persecution, this group of people. In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kind of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus is revealed. Though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy, for you are receiving the end result of your faith. Here it comes, the salvation of your souls. So, we leave Daniel on Sunday mornings. From the first time we met him, he worked to the best of his ability for the good of the people around him in this foreign land. He's respected as a person. They can find no fault in him. He's faithful to God, no matter what the consequences might be. May we live like that. Amen.